On behalf of the Arab Organization of Human Rights, I want to welcome you all to this seminar on the death penalty in Egypt. My name is Nassim Ahmed. I will be your host for the day. I think over the last, since 2013, I guess, we've watched with, great horror and shock. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, so we've been watching with horror and shock Egypt's slides towards greater repression and authoritarianism. And we've seen mass executions against political opponents mainly. And over the last 8 years in particular, the number of death sentences and executions has skyrocketed according to all major human rights organizations. And the trend really shows no sign of abating. Egypt now ranks among the countries, worst countries in terms of executions in the world. Only China and Iran, I think, have a more depressing human rights record. But Egypt is not China and Iran, two countries that are allied, that are foes to the West. And Egypt is the contrary, it's an ally of the West, deeply entrenched within the US economic and security system. So in that sense, it's even more alarming that the slide towards greater authoritarianism is in one sense supported by the West and America in particular. And one of the reasons many would speculate, one of the reasons for why democracies are producing the likes of Trump, the likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil, is because for decades, democracies have sustained and maintained authoritarian regimes like the Egyptian one beyond, decades beyond their sell-by date. So this is of course a much broader conversation, but there's a correlation between sustaining authoritarianism and allowing death penalties like this to continue, and why democracy is sliding all over the world. And with that in mind, I think it's amazing that Arab Organization for Human Rights has put together this this seminar to discuss the death penalty in Egypt, and we have some amazing panelists with us to dive into this conversation. I will introduce them one by one before they speak. One of our guests who has asked to go first, Massimo Ungaro, will only be here for 15 minutes, so I will introduce him first. Massimo is a member of the European Parliament, and he will be speaking about the European Parliament's position regarding death sentence in Egypt and what it can do to save the lives of dozens of opponents who are facing the death penalty in Egypt. So I will introduce my guests one by one, but Massimo, feel free to go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. Absolutely. Thank you for your invite. For me, it was important. I'm not a member of the European Parliament. I'm a member of the Italian Parliament, but I'm an elected representing the Italian citizens in Europe, so I follow European matters very closely. But it doesn't matter. Just wanted to precise. For me, it was important to be here today to show solidarity with the Egyptian people and the horrible continuous violation of human rights which we're witnessing in Egypt, and also these executions which happen without a fair trial. And this is something which in Italy has in a way mobilized also a lot of political attention by the public opinion following the Giulio Regeni case. Giulio Regeni was an Italian student studying in the UK, which was doing PhD and doing a field trip in Egypt, and was kidnapped, tortured, and killed by the Egyptian security forces. And this is an event which made the Italian public aware and discover what's happening in Egypt and in the Egypt of Al-Sisi, with continuous violation of human rights, which is going at a faster pace that used to happen under even Mubarak years. After that, the Italian and the European politics decided to react. At the European level, we have seen at least 4 resolutions by the European Parliament condemning the actions of Egypt. The same has happened from the Italian Parliament. The Italian Parliament has even instituted a parliamentary investigative committee on the death of Giulio Regeni, which I was a member of for 2 years, and has found out in the end that, it's pretty clear that there's a wide array of evidence showing that the Egyptian security forces have been responsible. And this parliamentary work gave us also an understanding of the horrible vastity of human rights abuses which are happening. And it's important for the international community to realize that, as you mentioned, Egypt remains an important country, an important ally for Western countries for a number of reasons, which goes from an ally against terrorism activities, also to the management of migration flows. But this should not in any way exempt us from condemning this brutal and terrible behavior towards its own population. And so it's very important to maintain pressure and attention. That's why we are trying to participate and to put pressure on this, even though it's not easy. It's not easy to try to invent or to find new instruments which are not going to attack the population, but are going to punish the regime. This is a reason why Italy suspended its own ambassador from Egypt for 1 year and a half, but then sent it back. I saw that even Turkey recently reopened the relationship with Egypt. But it's very important to maintain the pressure on the regime in Cairo to, if not to implement regime change, which of course is a topic which is to be discussed by the Egyptian people, but at least to try to hold them accountable. At the moment, we are trying to do our own part. I'm using the Regeni case, Mr. Hamed, just as a prism of what's going on. I'm sorry if I'm speaking for too long, but another couple of minutes before finishing my intervention. We, thanks to the Italian investigative authorities, we have the names and surnames of the 5 security officers which we think have been responsible for the Giulio Regeni massacres. They're all members of Egyptian national security. And we know that Egypt did sign the UN Convention against torture, or the 1984 Convention against torture, and also signed, is a member of International Court of Justice. And so we think there are the elements for Italy to try to implement a case against Egypt in this arena. Of course, again, I'm not talking about just Giulio Regeni, is the example for which I'm here with you today, but he's an example of the dozens of young journalists, activists, or normal Egyptians which are disappearing every day with unofficial arrests and executions without fair trial. And I think it's very important to keep attention, put international attention on it, and we will try to do our fair duty. And I will finish on this point. We have seen some kind of activism from a parliamentary side, as I said before. What we have not seen is any kind of action from the government side. So, for example, the European Council has discussed the matter of Egypt, but has not really undertaken any practical conclusion or any practical initiative towards Al-Tizir. Quite the opposite, we have seen some countries like France awarding some medals to Al-Sisi, La Légion d'honneur. And so this is something which, at the political level, has to make us think what we have to do as politicians to exert even more pressure on Egypt imposing them the respect of human rights. And I conclude on this. We are going to discuss this thing at the Italian Parliament in a couple of weeks. We are going to have a hearing with a few different Egyptian and Arab NGOs which are active in the fields of human rights, and we are going to try some of the activities we are trying to adopt in order to keep the attention of the public on this very important issue.
Thank you, Massimo, for that, giving us a very, very quick summarized outlook on what the EU's position is on Egypt, and especially in regards to human rights abuse. Some of the issues you mentioned will no doubt recur over and over again. For example, the Egypt's obligation under international law. I think is one thing we will discuss more in detail. And also, really, you spoke about instruments that are available to the West and Europe, which of course begs the question, why aren't those instruments being used? As we saw with Ukraine, for example, the West has a lot of instruments in its arsenal to deal with states and authoritarian regimes if it so chooses to do. But in the case of Egypt, and we saw how swiftly they can be enacted, but in the case of Egypt, very few instruments are actually used to change its behavior and its course. But these are all themes which I think we will discuss. But I know you said you need to rush off, Massimo, so thank you for that. But I will now take the time to introduce all my other speakers. So we have with us, after Massimo, the next speaker will be Bruce Fein Former. He is a US Attorney General. He will speak next on what is the international community's position towards the death sentence against Egyptian politicians. Then we will have Dr. Maha Azzam, chair of Egyptian for Democracy, also an academic, formerly working with Chatham House. Then we will have William Lawrence, who will speak after that. And last but not least, our final speaker will be Dalia Fahmy, who is also an academic from the US. I will give more details about the topic of their discussion, but if our next speaker, Bruce Fein Former, can speak on what is the international community's position towards a death sentence against Egyptian politicians. So Bruce, it's over to you. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, thank you for the generous introduction, and I'd like to commend your organization and all the participants here for seeking to advance the struggle for justice. It's an eternal struggle, justice against power. And those who are involved in the enterprise deserve commendation because it's more the exception than the rule. With that background, I think the international community in general frowns on the death penalty. The European community has banned it. Indeed, they will not extradite persons to the United States unless they're guaranteed we will not execute the accused. The International Criminal Court, which tries the crime of crimes, including genocide, does not have the death penalty as a punishment. We see it not only rampant in the kind of brutal regimes you described at the outset, but also Saudi Arabia, which commits the death penalty for drug traffickers' nonviolent offenses. But I think that in the case of al-Sisi, the death penalty and the charade trials need to be examined in a little broader light to do justice to the heinousness of his offenses against humanity, if you will. It seems quite clear that he has selected all political dissidents to crush, to destroy. Political opinion, in his view, is a valid criteria for denying someone any human right, including the right to live. And that kind of blanket opposition, blanket violence, blanket oppression is a crime against humanity under Article 7 of the International Criminal Court. And it seems to me that is a forum that needs to be pursued to try to insist that al-Sisi be brought to justice. A neighboring country, Sudan, had their president, Mr. Bashir, indicted for genocide. He's still under indictment. He's not been turned over yet for trial because the uncertain nature of the existing military quasi-civilian regime. But the Egyptian system obviously is not going to prosecute Mr. al-Sisi. Now you ask, what is the dynamic that would cause the United States and the West to ignore all of these flagrant violations? Well, they seem clearly upset with regard to the really somewhat less violations in Ukraine and elsewhere. And it's largely, I believe, because we permit Israel to govern our foreign policy in the Middle East. Israel is satisfied with al-Sisi if he honors the peace accord. Many of the maltreatments that the Israelis inflict on the Palestinians have some relationship to the kind of oppression that al-Sisi visits on Egyptian opposition groups. So Israel doesn't care. And also the West understands because they also see that the likes of Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, who want tyrants everywhere because they don't want the contagion, if you want to call that in a pejorative way, democracy, to catch fire in the Middle East. They know the sanctions that could be imposed on Egypt would be offset by the money that would flow in from these other countries. They already are there. Egypt, in some sense, has become a mercenary nation, or it will license its military to go fight in these other countries who don't have real armed forces. So it's more difficult to impose economic sanctions that bite when you have these super wealthy Arab countries that are willing to subsidize al-Sisi and bail him out economically if he needs to avoid money from the IMF or the World Bank that needs the West's approval. So that's where we are. It's not a happy picture. I don't want to be, Pollyannish about this, but I do think that in terms of the historical record of the International Criminal Court, that is the most promising venue to try to seek justice here.
Thank you, Bruce. I think it was a very short, succinct, but very informative in the sense that you've provided a broad understanding of why Egypt, as a authoritarian, despite being an authoritarian regime and dictator, needs to survive for the interest of the West and of course in particular Israel in this case as well. I think you hit the nail on the head, so to speak. Next to speak for us is Dr. Maha Azzam. She is the head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council and the founding member of the Brussels Initiative. Dr. Maha Azzam doesn't really need much of an introduction, so over to you, Maha Azzam. You will speak, I think, on, from what I've been told, the opponents of political opponents and their sentencing in Egypt. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the Arab Organization for Human Rights. This is an extremely important platform, and I'm very happy to be with my co-panelists today to raise these very difficult issues. Difficult, I say, because as someone who is Egyptian, I see men and women in Egypt every day facing a threat to life, being tortured in Sisi's prisons, and having no freedom of expression or freedom of assembly. Anyone can be picked up in Egypt, either for a blog, for no reason except that he or she may be suspect. Young people and older people are disappeared, face verdicts of executions. The litany of violations is long and is known to so many now through I would say, the great work done by leading organizations, human rights organizations, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many others, many other Egyptian organizations that are not allowed now to function in Egypt. The absence of civil society in Egypt has also brought about this situation where the voices of Egyptians inside cannot reach the outside world. Therefore, those who work outside and who can raise their voices, like the people on this panel, are of such paramount importance. Let me, because we have a short time, concentrate on a couple of things. And that is not so much the details of the violations, but the context, in order to understand why Sisi and his regime continue to execute people. And the subject of this meeting today is partly about executions. We need a moratorium on executions because there is an absence in the rule of law. And this regime, Sisi, came to power on the back of a tank. He hijacked Egypt's nascent democratic experiment. Whether you are with or against or were neutral as to the results of the democratically held elections of 2012, the fact remains that a coup occurred against a democratically elected president. And ever since that coup, there was no roadmap to democracy as Sisi mentioned after the coup, and the West was happy to promote the idea that there was a roadmap to democracy. There was a roadmap to massacres, such as in Rab'a and Nahda and various other squares of Egypt. There was the arrest of over 60,000 political prisoners of different political orientations. There is the continued fear that is instilled in Egyptians, so they dare not speak out or take to the streets. So the political context is that of a military coup against a democratic process that did not last more than a year before the military intervened once more to maintain its power and privilege, which it has exercised since 1952. One dictator after the other has ruled Egypt, has held Egypt with an iron fist, and through corruption and a coterie of supporters. The Sisi regime is probably one of the worst dictators that Egypt has ever seen. And he is supported by the West and by regional powers and is allowed to continue. He knows that he has to instill fear through executions, through torture, through an iron fist policy. He may remove the emergency law, but he finds different ways to instill the same law and even worse. He puts forward a strategy for human rights to con the outside world and whitewash his policies. He ensures that there are many women ministers and diplomats to tell the outside world that he's a liberal. He ensures that there are the minority Copts have a place in the legal system. All these are good signs in a democracy. But when a fascist leader pursues such symbols, and there are willing partners for him, all he does is entrench his regime, and there are those to help him entrench that regime. He wants to ensure, as he said before, that January 25th never happens again. He sent a message to the Egyptian people a few years ago and said the tanks are ready to roll in Egypt and can occupy every street and town and city of Egypt in a number of hours. He's telling the people, do not move. As Massimo said earlier, the issue of regime change is up to the Egyptian people. But my message here is that the outside world, particularly the United States and democratic governments, are enabling this dictator so that the Egyptian people cannot move. Not only can they not move, they cannot breathe. Egypt is a republic of fear, and Egyptians today are fearful in every move they make, and every person who raises their voice knows that there is an enormous price to pay, whether an actor, whether a journalist, whether a worker, whether a judge. And the judiciary is one other aspect that I want to mention quickly. The force of the military is certainly there, but it has used the judiciary in order to ensure that it is an arm of the military, to impose its verdicts. And many judges know that they are only in the positions they are in because they are administering the law according to the military. Following the coup, many judges sought the restoration of democracy, but they were dismissed from their positions. There were early resignations forced upon them, and worse. And there were some who languished in prison and died in prison. Egypt today uses the military, the media, in all its forms, in order, the Egyptian regime, I mean, uses the judiciary, the media, and all its institutions to serve one dictator and his policies and his vision, the vision of that is in alliance with the vision of regimes in the Gulf, and which serves regional powers. It is not the agenda of development. It is not the agenda for freedom for the Egyptian people or for the removal of corruption. It is an agenda to entrench the military in power, who control a vast percentage of the economy and who now control the various financial and business companies in the country, and who buy support from Western powers through military deals. I think it's worth mentioning that according to SIPRI, the Swedish think tank, since the coup, Egypt's arms purchases and imports have increased by 73%. There are willing sales of arms from France, from the United States, from various European countries. It is shameful that a dictator such as Sisi, who does not allow the right to life to Egyptians, should be enabled in this way by democratic governments, unless sanctions are carried out against this regime, different sorts of sanctions, so that the red carpet treatment is not given to his generals and to his coterie of supporters and ministers, so that action can be taken against the Egyptian people by him. Then I believe that history will record that both the United States and democratic powers not only enabled Sisi, but were ultimately complicit in the death and torture of Egyptians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maha, for this wonderful, really powerful speech. I think, I mean, you spoke about the litany of violations, the hollowing out of civil society, which therefore makes events like this more important, and the need to apply pressure from the outside. I think you made a powerful case for a moratorium on death sentences, which I think, you know, more than ever is needed, given how it's been instrumentalized, and also the comprehensive manner by which Sisi has been able to, sustain and impose entrench his authoritarian regime. I think it was powerful, and some of these things we may also come back to during Q&A session. Next to speak is William Lawrence. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at American University's School of International Service. He'll speak about how serious is the death sentence punishment against opponents in Egypt. So William Lawrence, over to you.
I was also asked to comment on the international issue, which is what I'll start with. But
sorry,
but let me.
With that then.
That's what you want to hear from me. You don't want to.
No, it's
not
what's
a lawyer.
been given to me. Sorry. Yeah.
But let me start by saying it's a real pleasure and honor to join this august group today. I'm happy to see through this mechanism. Bruce Fine, Ms. Azam, and Ms. Fahmy, who I have missed during the pandemic since we have not been in touch. I also agree almost entirely with everything that was said by the panelists before me, so I'm not going to repeat what they said. There's a couple of things I might nuance a little bit or add some information about. But the position is dire. The situation in Egypt is dire. The position of the international community is weak and feckless, and a lot needs to be done. I'm also sort of happy and sad to see this group on today, because it's the same people, you know what I mean, that have been making these arguments about Egypt for years without enough of a, let's say, expansion of the circle of people that are angry about Egypt, that are active about Egypt, and so I'm glad that people are still fighting these battles. But the number of people who are outraged about what's going on and the information that they have needs to be expanded, which is exactly the point of this panel. And I agree also with the statement that you provided me before the panel. Let me start by saying that the international community doesn't really exist. The international community is recreated each time people make it, force it to be recreated. There's no international community that's automatically outraged about anything or automatically takes action about anything. My colleague Jason Pack has a new book out called Libya and the Enduring Global Disorder that makes this case that there really is no international community. The UN is flawed in many ways. We're seeing that right now with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. It's the product of what its members want. and its members only take action if it's in their interests and or if there's enough pressure on them. And there's also hypocrisies and flaws at many levels. Just to give you an example, the US is calling for a special tribunal on Ukraine right now because it doesn't recognize the existing institution, the ICC, which was just referred to correctly by Bruce Fein, but the US isn't even party to that, so it can't even call for ICC action on Egypt because the US hasn't even joined that organization. And what Ukraine and Russia are teaching us, among other things, just quickly, is we need a reordering and rethinking of the international community, which is not properly set up in a number of ways right now to address these type of issues. Let me also say, taking it to Washington for a minute, that Washington is poorly organized on Egypt, poorly organized on similar issues. And I work, as Dalia and Mahano, on Egypt and Tunisia on a daily basis. And we had similar frustrations on the Libya account and on the Tunisia account. And it took an extraordinary organizing effort to, for example, correct the US position on Tunisia, which was sort of okay last August, terrible from September to February, and it's sort of getting back on track again. And, we're talking about, hundreds of meetings, and lots of statements and position papers. And when I was getting ready for this presentation today, I was sort of poking around the pro-Egypt democracy and human rights community in Washington to see if there was any sort of new actions or new activities or new formations. And what I found was very little. There's very little going on. And so until Egyptian diaspora in the US gets better organized, until more organizations speak out on Egypt than just POMED and the Egyptian Working Group, which have both been relatively weak on Egypt, and I'm happy to say more about that during the Q&A, and until there's new resources, human resources, financial resources, and all the other things that are necessary, not only will the public dialogue on Egypt be relatively more abundant, silent, and weak in Washington, but there won't be a constituency to press for it that's making itself heard. I did, which is what makes it happen. I did hear there's a group coming from London next week. I just heard about it this morning. I haven't heard about them having organized any meetings. I heard that there's another group that's thinking about sort of brainstorming, reorganizing the Egyptian community. But here we are, 9 years later, coming out of the pandemic, and the Egyptian community, diaspora, and pro-democracy advocacy community needs a jump start in Washington. It's, Egypt is, the diaspora is 10 times larger, the population's 10 times larger than the other countries I'm talking about. How bad things are much worse than 10 times worse, and yet the Egyptian activities in Washington are probably 1/10 of what we see on some of the other countries I mentioned. And so there's a whole lot to be done there. In terms of the US position, the withholding of $130 million of aid on human rights grounds in January is okay. It's a step. It's an action. The Egyptian government hates it, so in that respect, it's a good thing. The U.S. Levels of assistance to Egypt are fixed by the Camp David Accords, but there's a whole lot more that can be done through Congress to withhold larger amounts for longer periods to cause more pressure and more heartburn in Cairo than is currently the case. There's also been there's a number of opportunities right now when it comes to pressuring Egypt, the food crisis, the economic crisis, the shrinking private sector, a number of very serious financial and economic mismanagement issues that have gotten us to the point that even the Gulf states that write blank checks to Egypt to prop up the currency, which is crashing, and prop up the economy, which is weak and getting worse, are now asking for assets in exchange for their deposits in a way that is very problematic for the Egyptian people and the Egyptian government. And that, I think, creates an opportunity to say, hey, everyone, how about not writing these checks anymore and not asking for Egyptian assets in return? And by the way, the same Gulf states that are supporting Sisi have modified their positions on Yemen, have modified their positions on Libya, and they do respond to pressure when it's made. I just don't think that the pressure on the Egypt issue has been strong enough. There needs to be a cost to the US government, a cost to the UN, and a cost to the Gulf countries, among others, for the price of doing business, for the price of the status quo. And the cost right now, reputationally and politically, is not high enough, and it needs to get larger. In terms of what activists need to do, my advice is start with the back channel, meaning the best way to criticize international organs and the government is not starting with the public stating, but starting with the private statement and saying, here's what you're doing wrong and here's what we need you to do. The back channels are open. I'm involved in back channeling on a weekly, if not daily basis into the US government. I'd be happy to help this group with the back channel. And then when you go front channel, notwithstanding the excellent speech we just heard from Ms. Azam, what works at first, right, when you're rejuvenating your messaging is the constructive message first. So thank you for this, thank you for that, this is good, blah, 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 but you're completely ignoring this issue and that issue. There comes a time for naming and shaming, but international organizations, international governments respond the least constructively to just calling them out and naming and shaming. So here I'm just making a tactical point, not a strategic or a larger ethical or philosophical point, but a tactical point that the messaging mechanisms seem to me to be broken. The Egyptian Working Group and POMED, as I said, seem to be as much part of the problem as the solution, for reasons I'm happy to get into. And the way forward is to recreate that network of advocacy in Washington, which just seems to have fallen apart before and during the pandemic. On the issue of the death penalty, I can't add much to what the other panelists have said, except to say that, I'm personally opposed to it, as are most people like me, because in most cases, even in democratic societies, it's misapplied. And so in the context like Egypt, where it's completely politicized and arbitrary and atrocious and a war crime, it's 10 times the problem that it already is in the societies that use it democratically. And unfortunately, for example, right now I'm tracking quite closely what's going on in Tunisia, where it could be applied imminently against Tunisian parliamentarians, advised by a Tunisian government, advised by the Egyptian government right now. And I'm involved actively in naming and shaming the Tunisian government agents working with the Egyptian government on an Egyptianizing of the current Tunisian situation. And so I fully agree with all the legal points that were made. I'm not a lawyer. I do have a PhD in international law. I can tell you all about how the UN mechanisms work and that sort of thing, and what can be done to a degree at the ICC. But this is something that others specialize in more than me. I fully agree that with Bruce Fein about the Israel leverage over U.S. foreign policy, but I would add and modify to a degree of what Bruce Fein said to say that the United Arab Emirates in particular and the Arab Gulf countries in general are arguably just as powerful now in Washington as the Israeli lobby. Also, we're seeing a little bit of a diversity of opinion from within Israel and from American Jews that creates another opportunity. So to see Israel as the monolith, sort of pulling the strings of the puppet show, is to misunderstand the evolutions within the American Jewish community, which are often the most vocal on Egyptian human rights when they get the opportunity, particularly on the academic side. If you see some of the recent writing coming out of universities, and the BDS movement, which is run by American Jews largely, and all of those kinds of things. So I think we should take the advantage of let's say a fragmenting of Jewish and Israeli opinion, and the new role of big money from the Gulf in lobbying Washington to understand this recalibration of what goes into supporting Egypt in the Washington context. I did go to Egypt in 2014 to observe in the elections. And the thing related to what's going on, and this is, you may remember when the elections were extended by a day because the voting turnout was so low. An Egyptian judge in the voting room that I was observing and turned to me and said, and a very memorable woman, "Can they do this? Can they use force majeure to extend the election?" And I remember turning to him and said, "You're the Egyptian judge. Why are you asking me? I'm just an observer. And by the way, no way in heck can you do this under, but I mean, that was sort of my first glimpse into how manipulated and sort of willfully clueless these Egyptian judges are in this context. And I was back in Egypt in 2016 working on a security project for the risk firm I was working for at the time, related to the insecurity at Egyptian airports, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But I was fully expecting to be arrested or followed or prevented from entering Egypt due to my testimony on Egypt in 2015 in the Senate Foreign Relations community, in which I took a very strong position, I think one of the strongest positions anyone had taken to that time, and even subsequently on Egyptian human rights in the Congress. They did not block me from getting in. I found out later they just hadn't tracked, which is interesting because a whole session on Egypt in the U.S. Congress and the Egyptian government wasn't aware, who had spoken and what they had said. That sort of surprised me. But notwithstanding the systemic and systematic oppression going on in Egypt, there's a lot of keystone cops here too. There's a lot of incompetence in the Egyptian government. There's a lot of lack of awareness of what goes on in the world, as evidenced by the Egyptian group in Moscow right now and their trip to Poland, thinking they could actually have a role in this current crisis. And also when I was in Egypt at the time, there were cabinet reshufflings going on, and in each case the cabinet would get worse and worse and worse with each reshuffling. So let me say that notwithstanding the death and destruction of this regime, don't think that they're that competent. Don't think that they're that knowledgeable. Don't think that they're that good. You don't have to fear their competence. They are incompetent people as well as dictatorial and autocratic and atrocious and Machiavellian and butchers and everything else. But that comes as much from incompetence as competence. That's my point. And then just a quick note on the latest news from Egypt. I mean, I think to see Egypt as sort of just a linear bad thing is wrong. Things just got worse in Egypt with some of the most recent actions, the way in which instead of calling activists before they get arrested, they show up at your house in the middle of the day with 70 soldiers. The latest moves on the application of the death penalty, this Ikhtiyar program on Egyptian television, which is farcical if it wasn't so tragic. And the death going on among detainees in the Egyptian presence has reached a new level, a scary level. So I guess I'll make the concluding remark I will make is that the spotlight on Egypt has grown rather dim from the outside, and I fully encourage this group to shine it a little bit brighter. and that the Egyptians get organized in New York and Washington and internationally in ways they haven't really been in the recent years. And with that, I'm looking forward to listening to Dalia and the others. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, William. That was brilliant. You touched on a number of issues and themes, especially the behind the scene machinations regarding Egypt in Washington. I think your point on international community being recreated over and over again, as controversial as it may be, I think it is true. We always hear the terms like international community recreated over and over again. And I think your anecdote, the last anecdote, really shows how in Egypt, with the judge saying what he did to you, there is no respect for law or procedure within the country from amongst the highest judges within Egypt. So that really is another anecdotal indictment of what's happening in the country. There are, of course, other issues you touched upon, which we may revisit if we have time during the Q&A. Last but not least, our next speaker is Dr. Dalia Fahmy. She is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. So over to you, Dalia.
Thank you so much, Nassim, and thank you to the organization for hosting this and for having me, and for hosting it at a really critical moment, because we do know in Egypt there has been a history of an uptick in death sentences and executions during the month of Ramadan, especially towards the end of the month. And we need to talk about the strategic use of timing in terms of mass death sentences, but also executions at the moment to chill political activity or what could potentially be social activity towards the end of the month and going into the summer. So there's an importance of timing here, and I appreciate this coming together today, because we can anticipate, based on what we've seen in the past few years, executions coming in the next couple of weeks. But if we take a step back and look at Egypt in the past 9 years, if we look at the political landscape and we look at social and at the civil landscape, we know today there are between 60 and 80,000 political prisoners. The regime has had to build between 16 and 23 new prisons to handle the overflow. Amnesty International once called Egypt, after the Arab Spring, that this was Generation Protest, the youth who took to the streets. Now they're known as Generation Jail. We know that immediately after, there were about 830 cases per year of torture that were recorded. And when we talk about recorded, we can only estimate or fathom to estimate what the actual numbers are. Police systematically torture detainees with impunity. Prisons are referred to as cycles of hell. 1,250 people were disappeared in the past couple of months in the basements of jails, about whom there is no information. There have been at least 240 political activists who were arrested and tortured for online posts. Mass unfair trials targeting protesters, journalists, human rights workers are routine. Sweeping death sentences, the closures of NGOs and civil society organizations, the freezing of their assets, attacks on press freedoms, including 18 journalists who are still in prison, the blocking of 434 websites to filter content on Egypt. References of judges to disciplinary hearings who agree to even attend workshops on human rights. There have been at least 20,000 civilians tried in military courts, 150 of them children. There's no real adjudication of the law. The extension of the emergency laws of 1958 allows unchecked power up to the security forces to arrest and detain, and allows the government to impose censorship and to force evictions. So looking at this backdrop, how do we understand what's happening today in terms of mass executions or death sentences? There have been at least 521 executions that we know of. And according to figures, this could be even more than that, because we are not counting here extrajudicial killings that happen often, not just of prisoners, but of those who are seen as a threat to the state under the expansive terrorism law. The primary legal framework that Egypt is based on is the 1937 Penal Code, which establishes 2 methods of execution: hanging for civilians and firing squads for soldiers. This it was the formation of the terrorism court in 2013 when President Sisi took office that laid the ground, or after the military coup, that laid the groundwork for the rapid expansion of the use of the death penalty in recent years. Amendments to the penal code related to terrorism charges soon followed and were approved by the government in 2014, and they expanded the concept of terrorism and changed the punishment for terrorism crimes from life in prison to the death penalty. Now, we need to understand what this means in terms of what is under the terrorism law. Defaming the state falls under the terrorism law. If you have between 4,000 or 5,000 Twitter followers, you are seen as a social media influencer, a news outlet, if you will. And so if you say something outside of the state narrative, you can be held and tried under the terrorism law and even be liable to these sentences. And so we think about what's ultimately happening. It's this deep chilling effect that's occurring today in Egypt, and the weaponization of sentences and executions has led to an even deeper chilling effect. The scores of executions are, more than anything else, a product of the ruthless effort of the security establishment to reshape Egypt's political and social spheres according to the government's own autocratic vision. The government has almost uniformly co-opted the judicial system. The constitution and fundamental laws have been amended, and new laws have been introduced to circumvent due process guarantees or remove them altogether. Egyptian authorities have appointed special judges to these terrorism courts, and they've issued several hundred death sentences. They don't shy away from making clear that where they stand politically, denigrating all opposition, praising the army and the security forces. The government also introduced amendments in 2017 to undermine the independence of the top appeals court, a once highly respected institution. The government has instrumentalized the judiciary to imprison and execute political dissidents and to aggressively raise the cost for dissidents, sending the message that criticizing or opposing the government can literally cost people their lives. When we think about what this is leading to in Egypt, these trials that lead to death sentences and executions, we all know are now sham trials, accusing, for example, 90 people for the death of a single individual, and then without due process, trying them and calling for their execution. There are individuals who are being tried in cases where they were actually in prison when the crime was committed. And so these sham trials are resulting in an impunity of execution, an impunity of silence, and the culture and the state of fear that has been created in Egypt is unlike anything we've seen in the past. And so when we think about what this ultimately is leading to, it's leading to a moment where, those of us who've been studying the Middle East and democratization throughout the world and trends and rise of populism and hyper-nationalism, in the 2000s, when we would talk about Egypt and democratization, the major stressors points were, well, we need to push for political pluralism and political engagement and more voices at the table and more secure elections. Today, we're talking about stopping killing people with impunity. So the entire narrative on democratization throughout the world is no longer about good governance, transparency, human rights, accountability. It is simply about not killing with impunity. And it's not just Egypt. This trend is moving throughout the world. We talked about waves of democratization. We now know that there are waves of authoritarianism, Egypt being number 3 on the mass execution list. And so the trend is not just in Egypt. And so I think when we think about this in terms of foreign policy, international community, and interests, there needs to be a deeper conversation on where security comes from, where international security is going to come from, because several countries in the world that were historically seen as pillars of stability, for example, in the Middle East, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the fact that they're becoming more and more repressive in the long term will lead to not just greater instability, but will lead to countries that are going to have domino effects of instability throughout the region, and ultimately will force countries like the United States to rethink the strategy in the Middle East, but it might be too late. And so from a strategic point of view, understanding what happens when countries are fundamentally not just allowed, but almost given a blank check to remain authoritarian, to increase their impunity of cracking down on their populations, the narrative then of democratization and human rights will continue to fall on fewer and fewer ears. What we did see in 2011 was that the masses came to the streets believing that change came through democracy. Today, when the West supports authoritarian leaders, the fear is what is going to be the alternative? What will people see as the mechanism of freedom and justice? Is it going to be democracy, an integrated international community, when many in the region believe that the international community has turned its back on true democratization and human rights? Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia, for this really powerful, amazing speech. I think, your last point for me was really the crucial part of a lot of what you said, which is how quickly we change from a discussion about transition to democracy and democratization to, just stopping governments from killing people with impunity. I think that's a really, really powerful message. And I think that's the discussion that we will be having in the coming years, I think. And maybe likewise, there can be an equally quick flick of the switch and change again to something like what it used to be, where we are talking about democracy, where we are talking about transitioning a lot of these repressive regimes to something better than what they are now. And maybe we are at a moment where there is a window of opportunity. I don't know. That's a question which I would like to put out to all my guests here, while others think about questions they want to ask. It's a general question which I want to ask to all our speakers today, which is, with the Ukrainian, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think a lot of the world has been jolted into action and review where we are at the moment currently, what the health of the global system is. And there's also, I would say, a judgment on regime types, democracies and autocracies, excuse me, who are functioning better, which is sustainable. And that discussion is happening in academia, less so in the media, but definitely in the academia and amongst analysts. And sooner or later, I would imagine it would seep into popular discourse. So I wonder, to all my guests, do you think, with what's happening in Ukraine, with calls for indicting, prosecuting Putin, and a rise of a sense of international law, international community, and need to maintain a liberal order, global order, that this may be a window of opportunity? Or do you think this is a closing of the window for the kind of things Dalia was speaking about, which is, leading to more mass killings, more killing with impunity? So I'll start off with Dalia and then work my way back. What do you think? Is this a window of opportunity, or is this a closing of a window of opportunity when it comes to changing a lot of these Arab regimes from what they were, their behavior, to something akin to at least respecting basic human rights?
The failure of the international community to really engage and prevent what's happening in Ukraine is indicative of even less political will to defend democracy in the rest of the world. What's become very apparent is that the vulnerability in the system is much more than we anticipated. So for example, a country like Egypt, that 85% of its wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia, now is on the brink of starvation. IMF has, pushing Egypt to remove bread rations. And so you've got this domino effect of insecurity that is going to move throughout the world with bread, with the price of petrol, but also with the lack of commitment internationally for support of good governance, human rights, and individual liberty. Again, here is a country that is not being defended. We're seeing the atrocious images coming out of Ukraine this morning, and the international community did not act. Even the language of condemnation is not strong enough. The boycott, the divestment, the sanctioning of Russia, while strong, is definitely not enough. But even that language does not carry out into the regimes of the Middle East. We've seen, for example, the seizure of assets of a lot of the oligarchs throughout the world. We know that that global Magnitsky Act was meant to do that to authoritarian, to the kind of foot soldiers of authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, and it didn't accomplish that. And so there has to be a real rethinking, because it's not just us, right? There are people throughout the world watching and saying, you're talking about Ukraine like they deserve democracy and we don't. But we're also looking at an international community that simply does not have the political will to really stand behind this. And so we're seeing Russia and China have greater footprints in the region. You're seeing countries like Egypt who are hedging their bets right now and seeing who they ally with. And so the silence out of the Middle East in terms of governments on the Ukraine is because there's a wait and see game of the commitment of the West to democracy and the increasing footprint of Russia and China in the Middle East. And so even leaders are saying this is a waiting game to look at the commitment to democracy. Now, I apologize, I have to log off because I have a class, but thank you for having me. I hope this conversation continues and that we meet again and have deeper conversations. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. It was good that I went to you first for your answer. Thank you.
So I think I'll go next, and I'll start by saying, instead of the glass 90% empty position that Dalia took, I'm going to take the glass 20% full, or maybe a little higher position, because I really do think the Ukraine presents an opportunity. The lack of action on Ukraine, I think, is more a structural deficiency in the system, as I mentioned in my remarks, rather than a lack of alarm about how atrocious actions were in Ukraine. And the international community right now is more mobilized around defending Ukrainians than they've been mobilized defending any people anywhere in a long time. And so that presents an opportunity. And I think that the MENA region in specifically, and Africa and Asia more widely, have been seized with the multiple hypocrisies about the European positions, whether the way Black and brown migrants were being dealt with at the Ukrainian-Polish border, whether the rhetoric on democracy and human rights being applied in one situation, not another, the clearly racist faux pas the journalists were making and opinion leaders, and then sort of stopping there, or going even further in the media and social media and saying, therefore, we have to side with Putin and his, with his quasi anti-neo-imperial viewpoint, and start creating justifications or whataboutism that allows us to fall into further stasis on a critical issue of human rights, because we're creating false equivalencies. So I would say, seize the moment. If everyone seized on democracy, apply it to Egypt. If everyone seized on the issue of migrants, apply it to Egyptian migrants. If everyone seized with the food crisis caused by the fact that 80% of wheat in Egypt and the neighboring countries comes from Russia and Ukraine, and there's a food crisis impending, seize the moment. And I would say, in addition to that, we had a failed Summit for Democracy organized by the Biden administration in December, and part 2 coming up in, I believe, May or June. Seize the moment. They invited the wrong NGOs. Get invited. Use it to bang the drum about these issues. The world is seized with the role of Russia. Russia's deployed Wagner Group in about 20 countries now, doing nasty, nasty things. 90% of those forces, according to the Savant Center, have been relocated to Ukraine. That creates opportunities in the 20 countries where Wagner was deployed, not only to oppose Wagner, but to name and shame alliances with the Russians. And that goes right back to Egypt. Name and shame the Egyptian government for its position in alliance with Putin. And then the last thing I would say, and again, thank you for the opportunity, is there's a defense part here and there's an offense part. Putin is directly attacking and trying to unravel the international world order created after 1945, which was flawed in all the ways we know, but accomplished some things that we know, including the raising of global living standards quite dramatically over the last 70, 80 years or so, and the creation of 70 new nations that didn't exist before 1945, and new constitutions, and all of these things, Arab Springs, you know, a lot of things happened. So part of our global project right now is to defend international norms and principles and systems, however flawed, because an axis of countries are just trying to destroy them, led by Russia. And look at the vote today at the UN to see who's on Russia's side. And the vote wasn't as good as even the previous UNGO vote. They got about 80 people voting with them or abstaining. And then offense, which is what I was referring to in some of the previous comments, which is, if you believe in principle X, democracy, rule of law, okay, how are we going to apply it to this situation and that position? So you just piggyback on the outrage, whether in media or social media, and say, let's apply it, rather than just saying, you're all hypocritical, and therefore I'm not going to defend the Ukrainians because you're hypocritical about the Ukrainians. I think that's the wrong tack. So in that sense, I'm 20% to 50% glass full about the moment. If we seize it is another question. Thank you for that.
I feel optimistic, William. Thank you for that. So Maha, seize the moment. I mean, you spoke about you spoke about there not being a civil society in Egypt at the moment. It's been hollowed out. But I wonder, I mean, because of what's happening, the economic crisis, people suffering greatly, and globally, I would say there's a change in people's expectation. People's expectations about what they expect from the regimes, and to deal with authoritarian rulers like Putin or Sisi, it's much higher now. People understand what authoritarianism means. So would you say this is a window of opportunity for Egyptian population as a whole, and also Egyptians abroad, to seize the moment and shift and go on a counterattack offensive in exposing the crimes and ensuring the Egyptians have a better future?
Very much so. I don't want to repeat much of what was said so eloquently and much better than I can ever say it by the previous speaker on this issue. Let me say something that relates more to the Egyptians and the Arab causes specifically in the first instance. On a personal level, just over a week or a couple of weeks ago, I stood with the Ukrainians and the Syrians in front of 10 Downing Street in solidarity. I think that is key. We are all against dictators and authoritarians the world over. And that was my message as an Egyptian. And I went out to support the Syrians who had come out in London in much bigger numbers than they had previously, because actually they were coming out invigorated by their Ukrainian, the Ukrainians who had come out, and they'd allied together in one protest, raising Syrian flags and Ukrainian flags, and they had this lone Egyptian, myself, supporting a common cause. I think there is much to be done. Whether we partially succeed or we succeed in a way that is bigger than we imagine, we need global solidarity. We need to start thinking in much bigger terms, that we face a serious threat, and this is not just as Egyptians or as Syrians, or that we face a serious threat from authoritarianism, from Russia and China. And there is an opportunity here, not just for us, those that have suffered and those who have been oppressed by military regimes, but there's an opportunity, I believe, for the United States and for democracies to start rethinking again that the route to stability in the region is to ally with democratic forces on the ground. I'm not talking about orchestrating regime change. I am saying doing the right thing by people of the region. and not ignoring the democratic forces on the ground and the forces that are representative of the people that want peaceful change and want a transition that is away from dictatorship. So yes, it is an opportunity. My message as a political activist is to say very clearly, we are against all dictatorship, and it is a time to reach out across boundaries and to forget in some ways about nationalist causes and to start thinking big.
Thank you, Maha. Over to you, Bruce. I mean, global reset, I know that's a controversial term, but are we going to see a greater reaffirmation of the values and the principles which shaped the global human order, defending human rights, which you spoke so eloquently about? Are we going to see a reaffirmation of that in the aftermath of the Ukrainian invasion? Unmute yourself, by the way, Bruce.
Yes. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. I think I want to be earthbound here. We talk about an international order, and I think Thucydides said it in his History of the Peloponnesian War. Unfortunately, it's a grim truth. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. That is the international order that existed then. It existed now. I think the idea that the United States or countries support some grand theory of democracy is a false representation of history. We overthrew Mossadegh, the first legitimately elected prime minister of Iran, because of our boogeyman against the Soviet Union. We overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. We overthrew the Chilean properly elected president in favor of Pinochet. We invaded Saddam Hussein, who wasn't a threat to us. We now have a very substantial percentage of our own citizens who support Mr. Trump, who does not represent democracy in any sense. He believes that by turning law against citizens who vote and manipulating whatever powers he had, he could change the outcome of a US election. And at present, he is not before any grand jury. He has been able to get away with this largely today with impunity. So this idea that the West is there like a deus ex machina that's going to rescue the world is a complete delusion. Great Britain and France, they fought World War I, make the world safe for democracy. That was Wilson's banner, right? And what did they do? They won and they expanded their empires. Were they giving the votes to Algerians and Egyptians and others? Heck no. They supported all dictators there were. Then when they left the Middle East, they left nitroglycerin around because they drew the borders arbitrarily to satisfy their needs, not the homogeneity and DNA glue that you need to keep a country stable, something like that. I make these observations simply to try to be realistic about what to expect and what we ought to be involved in our own lives. Lord Palmerston said over 100 years ago, all countries have permanent interests, not permanent friends and enemies. They change all the time. So the fact is that countries are going to do what they feel is in their interest. They're not philanthropies, they're not charities, they will do what they want to do. That doesn't mean that we as individuals, as groups, don't need to take inspiration from the tank man on Tiananmen Square. He put his life on the line for Chinese seeking democracy. It didn't change anything. China is more authoritarian now than when Tank Man laid down and showed the courage that's needed to develop a civil society. But we're glad he did it. He's an inspiration. I think that we need to be satisfied with our own efforts, speak out, condemn, take whatever risks need to be in favor of justice, separation of powers, no dictators, but without this illusion that there's going to be anybody out there who's going to save us. We may fail, but we knew we made the world a little better place because it heard the voice of justice against power, no matter how rare it is. But I'm going to make these statements not to be pessimistic, just to examine this is what the history of the world is. It's unfortunate, but we're dealing with a species that celebrates proficiency in killing others. You look at the literature of all the countries. The armored knight is celebrated in the poetry and the romance. The philosopher, nowhere, right? The armored knight is who's heroized. and you get great applause by learning how to kill other people with great deftness. People who build the atomic bomb, gives it to Pakistan, he's celebrated. Our scientists at Alamogordo, who developed the first atomic bomb, they're celebrated because they could then kill hundreds of thousands in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I say these things just to try to be realistic. This idea that there's some international community that's devoted to democracy is simply not an accurate representation of what facts are. And just like you shouldn't flout Newton's laws of motion if you're planning on physics, we shouldn't flout these understandings of how international politics works in terms of our expectations. But we still celebrate people who are brave and courageous. Sometimes we can win a victory, but it's going to be more flukish than systemic, and that's simply descriptive. I certainly do not applaud it, but I'm not going to create an illusion painting something that's Pollyannish that isn't there.
Thank you, Bruce. I think that was a powerful intervention on your behalf. I'm wondering if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to ask. While you do think about a question, I think what you mentioned, Bruce, I think that is one part of the story. And I think throughout history, the realist version of politics has been dominant, and it has dictated and determined how the world has shaped up. But that said, there's also the other parts where we have civilization, we have laws which even at times world powers are duty bound to protect and defend. Though rare it may be, but these things do exist. So this, yes, the realist school where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, it's a fact. And international community is something that's constantly made up, which is the theme of one of our discussion today. Despite that, we still have something which we call a rules-based system. How did that appear? But of course, you can say it was in the interest of the US and the major powers, which
it's the rules that the United States makes up. Let me give you an example. We oftentimes use the Nuremberg trials after World War II as the gold standard of justice. Really, at the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis were accused of having slaughtered 10 to 20,000 Polish soldiers, catch-and-force massacre, right? We knew it was a fraud. The Soviet Union has agreed they were the ones who slaughtered the Poles because they figured they wanted to make sure Poland was a zero after the war ended. And yet we permitted the Soviet Union to sit and judge the crime that they had committed and fasten it on the Nazis. Why? Because the United States said, we want to get our soldiers who are in Soviet prison camps back. We don't want to do anything that's going to antagonize Stalin because we want to get our prisoners back. So they sold out, this system of justice. And so for decades, the Poles were told, no, it wasn't the Soviet Union who slaughtered all these officers. But there are other elements I could describe about Nuremberg as well that we don't apply in other instances. And all I'm saying is the rule-based order is the rules dictated by the big powers. Let us think immediately about Ukraine. The United States has had a theme of our sphere of influence called the Monroe Doctrine for over 2 centuries. Nothing happened in Central and South America or the Caribbean that the US didn't control, including even the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we went into Mexico, we were going into all sorts of countries. Now, and we continue to assert that prominency. We've gone to Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, whatever. Well, why is it from Russia says, how come we don't get our sphere of influence? And China says the same. China has the South China Sea. And when we send our aircraft carriers with nuclear missiles on them, China gets angry. And I can guarantee you, as an American, if China sent nuclear aircraft carriers off of Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., there'd be a Cuban Missile Crisis tomorrow. I
think it's quite, that analysis is pretty well known, and I think you are right there. The hypocrisy is pretty obvious, and I think exposing the hypocrisy itself is also an opportunity where if the world's population realizes, look, what's happening here. There is a blatant hypocrisy in the treatment of Ukraine when you compare it to the treatment of Palestinians, for example, or the treatment of the Middle Eastern populations in Iraq. So, but generally, I think there is a sense that people's expectations are changing. I think it needed, the argument, it needed a shock like Ukraine to really expose the hypocrisy, expose the fact that, the mess and the disease that has inflicted the international community, that is kind of, in one sense, paralyzed to do anything in the Middle East, to stop the human rights violations, stop the death penalties in Egypt. On the other hand, it's very quick to use all its arsenal, all its tools to go after Putin, undermine Putin. So these hypocrisies are being exposed, and I think in that sense there is probably a shift in people's expectations, people's ideas of what's possible. But it's a hope. It's a hope. But you're right, of course. The realist version of world politics is very powerful. It's true. It's just a statement of fact rather than a statement of what we wish human beings to be. And I think there is an instinct within human beings that they want something more than simply, this is the fact. I think we can do better. That sentiment does still exist within human beings and manifests in politics at times to time. And though rare it is, it does manifest sometimes. I wonder if any of my other guests want to intervene. If there are no questions, gone.
I'll come in. If I may just, if I may very quickly just add something to your comments. Look, I certainly agree that the reality of the international system and the power politics that have been played have ensured that we have systems in the Middle East and throughout the world that are dictatorial and authoritarian because it serves certain interests. But it's also very important that we realize that the balance of power on the ground in these countries and in Egypt, which is the subject of today's meeting, needs to change. And that balance needs to change at the hands of Egyptians themselves. But the obstacles that exist because of the alliances, regional and international, are a serious blockage because they are promoting the tyranny that exists in Egypt, even if they think they're not doing so. And in a sense, we have to continue to pressure. We have to continue to advocate. And we also need to perhaps create a better understanding, given the Ukraine crisis, that stability may lie elsewhere completely. It doesn't mean that perception is going to seep in very quickly or at all, perhaps, in the foreign ministries of various democracies or through the administration in the United States. But what I'm saying is that we need to rethink at a different level. The Egyptians need to do what they need to do, but it's very difficult given the tyrannical system that exists. But also on a broader level, Ukraine is a reminder to us that turning a blind eye to a Putin or a Sisi or a Bashar in the long term really threatens notions of stability. And it's a rethink of policy is not about these countries or administrations becoming idealistic or principled. It's about realpolitik too and interests. So the United States and its allies needs to rethink where it's going, given the rise of Russia and China. And in so doing, if it really wants to pursue its own interests, it needs to think that it needs real allies in the Middle East, allies that it can rely on that are committed also to democracy. And that really is where I was going with part of the argument I was making earlier.
Thank you, Dr. Maha. Do you want to say anything, William? If not, I think we'll wrap up.
I'd like to give an hour-long lecture and reply to what I just said. But let me hit a couple of points. First of all, with all due respect to the very intelligent and cogent and historically informed argument that Bruce Fein made, so I'm not coming at him in that respect. I mean, there's a lot there, and I'm sure he could go on for at least another hour giving examples to back up, because there are plenty of examples to back up everything Bruce Fein said. So I'm not arguing with that side of what he said.
I do have some responses. Number one, Putin's argument is a distortion of Bruce's argument, right? If that's the Thucydidean world we live in, I want it to be that way. And we have to stand up against that for all the reasons I just heard. Number two, Thucydides was not in favor of democracies and the Pericles experiment. But he was okay with the concept of democracy with the condition that there was a good leader, which is a good tale to tell for Egypt or any country. It's not just the system, it's the leadership. Democracy can't work without a good leader, was his point, and Socrates had a similar point. Also, if you look at the Thucydides trap, the idea that somehow the US is about to go to war with China or about to go to war with the Russia-China axis as inevitable is being challenged brilliantly in the academic journals as not necessarily going to come true if we understand the nature of the US-Chinese relationship as being a little bit different than a Thucydidean vision. And there's a war that can be avoided there between the United States and China, or a China axis. Let me say that we had an enlightenment. There's a reason why Bruce gave examples from World War I and not post-World War II, notwithstanding the Cold War stuff. I taught a whole class on this, the history of global politics, because we covered all this. And the Monroe Doctrine is not really operational in every way in Latin America. It's challenged on a daily basis in Latin America. And there's a reason why we have the phrase better angels. I wrote a whole primer once on Chinese political philosophies, and sort of when you look at political philosophy, it builds out from your view of human nature, which is why you, moderator, went to that point. Like, what's your view of human nature? Are humans, do they have better angels? Does the community have better angels? Can they do a better job? And I firmly fall down on that camp, which is where, notwithstanding how often we all fall down globally, that there is an opportunity here. What's my evidence? 2011 to 2013 happened in Egypt. Why do we have 80,000 people in jail in Egypt? Because 80,000 people among millions of others stood up against this and suffered the consequences. So we do have better angels. We have a lot more than one guy in front of a tank. We have a lot more than a few people that are upset about Egypt, notwithstanding my somewhat dark comment I made at the beginning of my comments today. So it's just a matter of connecting our aspirations to our actions, and looking for that leadership, to get back to Thucydides on Pericles, and looking for the actions we can take that have the highest positive consequence. And right now, the highest possible consequence, whether we're talking about Putin or Kais Saied or Sisi, and this is the last new point I'm going to make, is focusing on the malice and incompetence of that leader, rather than making it about structures or inevitable structures. We have terrible leadership in Putin and terrible leadership in Sisi that needs to be challenged, humiliated, spotlighted, exposed, railed against, trolled, back-channeled, front-channeled. All of those actions can have positive results, because we're not stuck with Sisi forever. Sisi will go at some point, and how we get there faster is really the only question behind the questions for today's event. Thank you for that opportunity.
Could I just make a closing comment, because I know we've had a lot of time here. We could go on for.
We could. I wanted to end on that. I wanted to end on that positive note.
I think that this is not to be pointed here, but I think we need to take instruction from James Madison. Madison said, don't depend upon personalities. We don't have angels. We need to set ambition against ambition. And if you don't change the structure that we've talked about and just look at the personalities, it's not going to happen. And we just look at the recent effect. Aung San Suu Kyi wins a Nobel Peace Prize, and then she becomes complicit in a genocide. right? Because she's sitting in a structure where you have limitless unchecked power. So if you don't focus on diffusion of power and checks and balances,
Both.
we're going to stay back. We're never going to make any progress.
It's structure, structure and
Families
agency.
are not going to work on their own.
I must come in here just for
Go
one
on, Maha.
second. Really,
We'll end,
because
we'll end on your note. We'll end on
No,
your note.
I actually just want to say that you've opened the door to what really is our remit. That's why we're called the Revolutionary Council,
Yeah.
the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, because Egypt has suffered 52 years of the same structures, the same institutions. It doesn't mean that we want violent change by any means. We believe that we can have revolutionary change through fighting corruption, through democratically elected institutions. But ultimately, yes, we need a change of the system. We need structural change. We need to fight corruption and the failure. And the word failure is very important. That's why I agree with the speaker who said, the incompetence of one dictatorship after the other, which has really boomed under this dictator, where, the level of poverty in Egypt is at the moment insurmountable and people are suffering. And this started before Ukraine and is even worse now with the high prices, the fall in the currency. Egypt is truly in trouble economically and politically. It needs serious change, not just change of the man at the helm. Thank you.
I agree with
Maha.
both
I
of
think
those last comments.
On that note, we'll end because we have overrun our time. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. We started off, of course, with Egypt, looked at some of the bleak facts about the death penalties there, and also we spoke about Thucydides and philosophy, but we turned back to Egypt, back to earth. And I think it's been a very enlightening conversation. I want to thank all my guests, Dr. Maha Azzam, Massimo Ungaro, Bruce Fein, William Lawrence, and also Dalia Fahmy. I hope whoever tuned in from home to listen to this, you've enjoyed this. If you haven't watched it, I'm sure the link will be available on AOHR where you can see, download, and watch the entire conversation once again. Thank you all, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.